In the serene hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 32-year-old Amish man Samuel Yoder lives a simple life with his loyal horse, Thunder. One foggy autumn morning, while collecting firewood deep in the forest, they stumble upon 3 orphaned bear cubs, injured, starving, and clinging to life beside their deceased mother. What begins as an act of mercy transforms into a profound journey that challenges Samuel's faith, tests his community's rigid traditions, and ultimately reveals an extraordinary connection between man, animal, and nature that will forever change not just Samuel's life, but the entire Amish settlement's understanding of God's creatures and the true meaning of family. The morning mist hung like a burial shroud over the Lancaster County forest, so thick that Samuel Yoder could barely see Thunder's dark mane bobbing ahead of him. The September air carried that peculiar chill that whispered of winter's approach, and Samuel pulled his black wool coat tighter around his broad shoulders. At 32, he had walked these woods countless times since childhood, but never had they felt so eerily silent. Thunder, his faithful percheron horse of 8 years, suddenly stopped. The massive animal's ears pivoted forward, nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made him nervous. Samuel had learned long ago to trust Thunder's instincts. The horse had an uncanny ability to sense danger that had saved them both more than once. "What is it, boy?" Samuel whispered in Pennsylvania Dutch, his calloused hand reaching up to stroke Thunder's neck. The horse's muscles were tense beneath his touch, trembling slightly. Then Samuel heard it, a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind through dying leaves. But it wasn't wind, it was whimpering, the kind of desperate, broken sound that spoke of profound suffering. Samuel's heart, already accustomed to the harsh realities of farm life, nevertheless quickened. He'd heard animals in distress before, sheep caught in wire, calves separated from their mothers. But this was different. This sound carried a weight of tragedy that made his stomach clench. "Stay here, Thunder," he commanded softly, tying the horse's reins to a sturdy oak. Thunder stamped his hooves in protest, clearly unhappy about being left behind, but Samuel needed to investigate alone. Whatever was making that sound might spook his horse, and a frightened Thunder was 2,000 pounds of unpredictable muscle. Samuel moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence, his work boots finding purchase on the damp earth without disturbing a single twig. The Amish might eschew modern technology, but they knew the old ways of moving through nature like ghosts. His father, Eli, had taught him well before the cancer took him 3 winters past. The whimpering grew louder, punctuated now by small growls, not aggressive, but desperate, almost pleading. Samuel pushed aside a curtain of low-hanging pine branches and froze. Before him lay a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A massive black bear, clearly a mother by her swollen teats, lay motionless on her side. Blood had pooled beneath her, dark and thick on the forest floor. 3 cubs, no more than 6 months old, huddled against her cooling body. One had a deep gash along its shoulder, the wound angry and infected. Another's front paw was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The third, the smallest, seemed unhurt physically, but was the source of the heartbreaking whimpers, its tiny paws pushing desperately at its mother's face, trying to wake her. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He knew he should back away slowly. Bear cubs meant a protective mother nearby, and even though this mother was clearly dead, approaching wild bears went against every principle of safety he'd been taught. But as he watched the smallest cub collapse from exhaustion, its cries becoming weaker, something deep within him, perhaps what his late mother would have called the voice of God, urged him forward. He took a tentative step, then another. The cubs noticed him now, the 2 injured ones trying to bare their tiny teeth in a show of defiance that would have been comical if it weren't so pitiful. The smallest simply looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding for such a young creature, as if it knew its fate, rested in the hands of this strange, tall figure. Samuel knelt slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He spoke in low, soothing tones, the same voice he used to calm frightened foals. "Shh! Little ones, I won't hurt you. I promise." The mother bear's body was already stiff with rigor mortis. She'd been dead at least a day, maybe two. Samuel could see no obvious wounds on her, no signs of attack. Perhaps disease or poisoning from something she'd eaten. The cubs had likely been without food for days, and the injured ones needed immediate care or they would follow their mother into death. Samuel faced a moment of profound decision. The Amish way was to live simply, to avoid unnecessary entanglement with the English world. Taking in wild bear cubs would require veterinary care, would draw attention, would disrupt the careful balance of his community. Bishop Stoltzfus would certainly disapprove. The elders would counsel him to let nature take its course. But as Samuel looked into those 6 eyes, eyes that held fear, pain, and a desperate hope, he thought of the parable of the Good Samaritan. He thought of his father's words. "Samuel, God's creatures are all part of his plan. Sometimes he puts them in our path, not to test our faith, but to strengthen it." The smallest cub attempted to stand, but collapsed again, too weak from hunger. That decided it. Samuel carefully removed his coat, speaking continuously in soft tones. The cubs watched him warily as he approached their mother's body. He gently wrapped the smallest cub in his coat, surprised when it didn't resist. It seemed to understand on some instinctual level that this was its only chance. The other 2 cubs were more challenging. The one with the broken paw swiped at him weakly when he tried to approach, but exhaustion soon won over fear. The one with the shoulder wound growled, but was too infected with fever to put up much might. One by one, with infinite patience and gentleness, Samuel gathered all 3 cubs. They were heavier than he expected, probably 30 pounds each, and carrying all 3 would be impossible. He would need Thunder's help. As he struggled back through the forest with his living burden, Samuel's mind raced. He would need help, medical help, that the Amish community couldn't provide. He thought of Dr. Shera Chen, the veterinarian who had helped when Thunder had developed colic last year. She was one of the few English his community truly trusted, having proven her respect for their ways time and again. Thunder's eyes widened when he saw Samuel emerge with the cubs, and the horse took several nervous steps backward, pulling against his tied reins. "Easy, Thunder. Easy, boy. They're just babies. They need our help." It took Samuel nearly 20 minutes to calm Thunder enough to fashion a crude sling from rope and blankets he kept in his wagon for emergencies. The cubs, exhausted and perhaps sensing safety, had fallen into fitful sleep against his chest. The journey home was the longest 2 miles of Samuel's life. Thunder, despite his initial fear, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The horse walked with unusual care, avoiding roots and holes that might jostle the precious cargo. As Samuel's farm came into view, the white 2-story house with green shutters, the massive red barn, the neat rows of corn stretching toward the horizon, he saw a figure on his porch. His heart sank. It was Rebecca Miller, the widow who helped with his household since his mother's passing. Rebecca was kind but traditional, and she would not understand this. "Samuel Yoder," she called out, her voice sharp with concern. "What in the Lord's name?" She stopped mid-sentence as she saw what he carried. "Bears? Samuel, have you lost your mind? They're orphans, Rebecca, injured and starving. Their mother is dead." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. She was a mother herself, with 4 grown children, but concern quickly replaced sympathy. "The bishop will not approve. You know this." "Then the bishop need not know. Not yet." Samuel's voice held a determination that surprised even him. "Will you help me or not?" Rebecca studied him for a long moment. In the 2 years since his mother's death, she had never seen such fierce resolve in Samuel's usually gentle eyes. "What do you need?" "Warm milk, diluted with water, soft blankets. And send young Timothy to fetch Dr. Chen. Tell him it's urgent, but to be discreet." As Rebecca hurried to comply, Samuel carried the cubs into the barn. He created a makeshift den in an empty stall, lining it with fresh hay and old quilts. The cubs stirred as he settled them, the smallest one opening its eyes to look directly at him. In that moment, Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a connection he couldn't explain, a sense that his life had just taken an irreversible turn. Thunder, curious now that the cubs were settled, peered over the stall door. The largest cub, despite its injured shoulder, lifted its head to look at the horse. The two creatures regarded each other with what Samuel could only describe as mutual recognition. Two of God's creatures acknowledging each other's right to exist, to need help, to receive mercy. The sun was setting, painting the barn in golden light, when Doc Chen's pickup truck pulled quietly into the farmyard. Sarah Chen was a small woman of perhaps 40 years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that could gentle the most frightened animal. "Samuel," she said simply, grabbing her medical bag. "Rebecca told me, where are they?" As she examined each cub with professional efficiency, her expression grew increasingly grave. "The shoulder wound is badly infected. The broken paw needs to be set and splintered. They're all severely malnourished and dehydrated." She looked up at Samuel. "I can help them, but you need to understand what you're taking on. These are wild animals. In Pennsylvania, keeping them without proper permits is illegal. If the Game Commission finds out—" "I understand," Samuel said quietly, "but I cannot let them die." Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I've always respected how your people care for animals. But this is different, Samuel. Bears aren't livestock. They grow fast, and even hand-raised cubs can be dangerous." "Then what would you have me do?" "Technically, I should report this. The cubs should go to a wildlife rehabilitation center." Samuel's jaw tightened. He had heard of such places. Overwhelmed, underfunded, where animals often died from neglect or were euthanized for convenience. "No," Dr. Chen sighed. "I thought you'd say that." She began pulling supplies from her bag. "Then we do this my way. I'll teach you everything you need to know. But Samuel, you must promise me, if they become dangerous, if they threaten anyone, you'll let me contact the proper authorities." "I promise," Samuel said, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. As Doc Chen worked on the cubs, cleaning wounds, setting the broken paw, administering antibiotics she technically shouldn't have been giving to non-domestic animals, Samuel held each cub in turn, marveling at their resilience. Despite their trauma, they submitted to the treatment with only minor protests. "They trust you," Dr. Chen observed, surprise evident in her voice. "I've never seen wild cubs this calm with a human. Perhaps they sense they're safe. Perhaps." She finished bandaging the shoulder wound. "Samuel, I need to ask, why? Why risk everything for 3 bear cubs?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, stroking the smallest cub's head as it slept in his lap. "My father once told me that God doesn't always call us to do what's easy or what makes sense. Sometimes he calls us to do what's right, even when we don't understand why." He looked up at Dr. Chen. "When I saw them there crying over their dead mother, I heard that call." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Your father was a wise man. I remember when he brought Thunder to me as a colt with a twisted intestine. Everyone said the horse wouldn't make it, but your father insisted we try." She glanced at Thunder, who was still watching the proceedings with interest. "Look at him now." As the evening deepened into night, Doc Chen showed Samuel how to prepare formula for the cubs, how to check their wounds, what signs of distress to watch for. She left him with supplies, antibiotics, hidden in unmarked bottles, special formula powder, medical implements that no Amish barn should contain. "I'll come back tomorrow night," she promised. "Same time. We'll need to monitor them closely for the first week." After she left, Samuel sat in the stall with the 3 sleeping cubs. Rebecca brought him dinner, fresh bread, apple butter, cold ham, but he barely touched it. His mind was too full of the magnitude of what he had just committed to. "Your mother would have done the same," Rebecca said softly, standing at the stall door. She had a heart for helpless creatures, The bishop won't see it that way. The bishop doesn't need to know. Not yet. Rebecca's voice held a surprising firmness. But Samuel, you cannot do this alone. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves in our community. She was right, of course. In a community where everyone knew everyone's business, where conformity was not just expected but required, hiding 3 growing bear cubs would be nearly impossible. But as Samuel looked down at the cubs, the largest one's shoulder already looking better after Chen's treatment, the middle one's splinted paw wrapped carefully in white gauze, the smallest one curled against his leg with absolute trust, he knew he would find a way. Thunder nickered softly from his position at the stall door, as if voicing his agreement. The horse had accepted the cubs with surprising ease, and Samuel took that as a sign. If Thunder, who had every reason to fear predators, could show such compassion, how could Samuel do less? The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the barn windows. Samuel carefully extracted himself from the pile of cubs and covered them with a warm blanket. They would need names, he realized, but that would come tomorrow. Tonight it was enough that they were alive, safe, and no longer alone. As he walked back to his house, Samuel paused to look back at the barn. Through the window he could see Thunder standing guard over the stall, the faithful horse having appointed himself protector of the orphaned cubs. God works in mysterious ways, Samuel murmured to himself, his father's favorite saying. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first light of dawn crept through the barn windows, painting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Samuel hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in a chair beside the cubs' stall, waking every hour to check on them, to offer them bottles of the special formula Dr. Chen had prepared. The smallest cub had taken to the bottle immediately, suckling with desperate hunger. The other 2 had been more reluctant, but survival instinct eventually won over wariness. Now, as the farm began to stir with morning sounds, roosters crowing, cows lowing for their morning milking, Samuel faced his first full day as caretaker to 3 bear cubs. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but lighter somehow than the alternative of having left them to die. The largest cub was awake, attempting to explore the stall despite its injured shoulder. Samuel had already decided this one would be called Moses, saved from certain death and bearing the strength to lead. The middle cub with the broken paw remained still, watching everything with intelligent eye. This one reminded Samuel of his grandfather, David, who had broken his leg in a farming accident, but never complained, bearing his pain with quiet dignity. David, it would be. The smallest, the one who had won his heart from the first moment, was curled against Thunder's leg. Somehow, during the night, the massive horse had lain down beside the stall, and the tiny cub had crawled through the slats to nestle against Thunder's warm belly. The horse, who could have easily crushed the cub with one movement, remained perfectly still, only his eyes moving to track Samuel's approach. "What shall we call you, little one?" Samuel whispered, gently stroking the cub's fuzzy head. The cub opened its eyes, deep brown, almost human in their expressiveness, and made a small chirping sound. In that moment, Samuel remembered the Bible story his mother used to tell him about Esther, the brave young woman who saved her people despite being small and seemingly powerless. "Esther," he said softly, "you'll be Esther." The morning feeding was easier than the night before. Moses actually grabbed the bottle with his paws, trying to control the flow. David was methodical, patient, taking breaks between sucks to breathe deeply. But it was Esther who concerned Samuel most. She drank, but weakly, and her eyes kept closing, as if the effort exhausted her. "Come on, little one," Samuel encouraged, tilting the bottle to help her. "You need your strength." The sound of buggy wheels on gravel made Samuel's heart skip. Visitors this early meant trouble. He quickly covered the cubs with a blanket and stepped out of the barn, closing the door firmly behind him. It was Jonas Byler, his nearest neighbor, and fortunately, one of the biggest gossips in their district. Jonas was a good man, but had a tongue that wagged faster than Thunder's tail when he was happy. "Morning, Samuel," Jonas called cheerfully, climbing down from his buggy. Rebecca Miller mentioned you had some excitement yesterday, said you brought home some injured animals. Samuel kept his expression neutral, a skill every Amish man learned early when dealing with nosy neighbors. Just some raccoons, Jonas. Found them orphaned in the woods. Raccoons? Jonas's eyebrows raised. Rebecca seemed mighty flustered for just raccoons. And why did you need that English veterinarian? They were badly injured. Didn't want them suffering. Jonas studied him with the shrewd eyes of a man who knew when he wasn't getting the whole truth. Samuel, we've been neighbors for 15 years. Your father helped raise my barn. If you're in some kind of trouble. No trouble, Jonas. Just doing what seemed right. Before Jonas could probe further, a pitiful cry emerged from the barn. High-pitched and distinctly un-raccoon-like. Jonas's eyes widened. That doesn't sound like any raccoon I've ever heard. Samuel sighed, recognizing defeat. Jonas wouldn't leave without knowing the truth. And lies went against everything the Amish believed in. Come with me. But Jonas, you must promise to keep this between us. At least for now. Jonas nodded, curiosity overcoming caution. Samuel led him into the barn, to the stall where the cubs were now all awake and vocal, demanding their morning feeding. Jonas gasped, taking several steps backward. Bears? Samuel, are you mad? Those are bears. Cubs, Samuel corrected quietly. Orphaned cubs who would have died without help. The bishop doesn't need to know. Not yet. Jonas stared at the cubs, then at Samuel, then back at the cubs. Moses was trying to climb the stall door despite his bandaged shoulder. David was methodically chewing on his splint, and Esther had returned to Thunder's side, the horse lowering his massive head to nuzzle her gently. That's not natural, Jonas breathed, watching the interaction between horse and bear. Thunder should be terrified. Perhaps Thunder understands something we don't, Samuel suggested. Perhaps God's creatures have more capacity for compassion than we give them credit for. Jonas was silent for a long moment, watching as Samuel prepared 3 bottles of formula. The cubs recognized the bottles now, Moses standing on his hind legs in excitement, David chirping softly, and Esther attempting to walk towards Samuel, but stumbling over her own weak legs. Let me help, Jonas said suddenly, surprising them both. He took one of the bottles, David's, and carefully entered the stall. The cub regarded him solemnly before accepting the bottle. My grandfather, Jonas said softly, as David drank, used to tell stories of the old country, before our people came to America. He said there was a man in his village who raised an orphaned wolf. Everyone said he was foolish, that the wolf would turn on him. But that wolf protected his farm for 12 years, keeping other predators away from his livestock. What happened to it? Died of old age, curled up on the man's doorstep like a faithful dog. Jonas looked up at Samuel. The elders said it was a miracle, a sign that God's plan isn't always what we expect. After the feeding, Jonas helped Samuel clean the stall and checked the cub's wounds. Moses' shoulder was already showing improvement, the infection retreating before Dr. Chen's antibiotics. David's splint remained secure, and he was learning to move without putting weight on the injured paw. But Esther remained weak, and Samuel noticed she felt warm to the touch. Too warm. She has a fever, Jonas observed, his farm-trained hands recognizing the signs. She needs more than we can give her. As if summoned by their need, Dr. Chen's truck appeared in the farmyard. She had said evening, but here she was at barely 8 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes. I couldn't stop thinking about them, she admitted, grabbing her bag, especially the little one. How is Hugh? Samuel explained Esther's condition while Dr. Chen examined her. The vet's expression grew increasingly concerned. She's developed pneumonia, Dr. Chen said finally, probably from exposure and stress. Cubs this young have weak immune systems, and losing their mother. She trailed off, pulling out a stethoscope. Can you help her? Samuel asked, surprised by the desperation in his own voice. I can try, but Samuel, she needs round-the-clock care. Fluids, medications, every 4 hours, constant monitoring. And even then, I'll do it, Samuel said immediately. Samuel, Jonas interjected. You have a farm to run, cows to milk, fields to tend. You can't. Then I'll help. Rebecca's voice came from the barn door. None of them had heard her arrive. She stood there with a basket of fresh eggs and a determined expression. My children are grown. My days are my own. If Samuel needs help saving God's creatures, then I'll help. John looked between the three Amish faces. Samuel's determined, Jonas's conflicted, Rebecca's resolute. You people never cease to amaze me, she murmured. All right, let me show you what needs to be done. The next hours were a blur of medical procedures that seemed almost sacrilegious in the simple barn. Dr. Chen set up an IV drip for Esther, hanging the bag from a nail, usually used for horse tack. She showed Samuel how to administer injections, how to monitor breathing, how to recognize signs of distress or improvement. Moses and David watched anxiously as their sister received treatment, making soft, whimpering sounds that broke Samuel's heart. Thunder maintained his vigil, occasionally reaching down to touch Esther gently with his nose, as if checking she was still breathing. I've never seen anything like it, Dr. Chen said, watching the horse's behavior. It's like he's adopted them. Thunder's always been special, Samuel replied. Father said he had an old soul. By midday, word had somehow spread, perhaps through Jonas despite his promise, or perhaps through that mysterious network of communication that existed in every Amish community. Samuel found himself with more visitors than his farm had seen since his father's funeral. First came the Zimmerman brothers, Abraham and Isaac, claiming they needed to borrow a plow blade, but clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever Samuel was hiding in his barn. Then Mary Lapp arrived with a casserole. Just being neighborly, she said, though her eyes kept darting toward the barn. Even old Elizabeth King, who rarely left her house, suddenly needed to return a pie plate she'd borrowed 3 months ago. Samuel managed to keep them all away from the barn, but he knew it was only a matter of time. In a community where privacy was as foreign as electricity, secrets had the lifespan of morning dew. The crisis came just after sunset. Esther's breathing had become labored, each breath a monumental effort. Her tiny body was burning with fever despite the medications, and she'd refused her last 2 feedings. We're losing her, Dr. Chen said quietly, checking her vitals for the dozenth time. Her body's too weak to fight. No, Samuel said firmly. There must be something else we can do. Samuel, I've done everything medically possible. Sometimes, despite our best efforts. No, Samuel repeated, gathering Esther's limp form into his arms. She was so small, so fragile, her fur damp with fever sweat. She survived losing her mother. She survived days without food. She didn't fight this hard just to give up now. He sat in the hay, cradling Esther against his chest, and began to sing. It was an old Amish hymn, one his mother had sung to him when he was sick, as a child. The melody was simple, haunting, speaking of faith and hope and the promise of dawn after the darkest night. Moses and David crept closer, pressing against Samuel's legs. Thunder lowered his great head, his breath warm on Esther's tiny form. Even Jonas and Rebecca joined in the hymn, their voices blending in the harmony their people had perfected over centuries. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as something shifted in the barn, not just the atmosphere, but something deeper, more fundamental. She wasn't a religious person, had always put her faith in science and medicine. But watching this simple man pour his heart into saving a tiny bear cub, surrounded by a community that had rallied despite the risk to their own standing, she felt something she couldn't explain. Esther's breathing seemed to ease slightly. Her tiny paw twitched, then gripped Samuel's shirt. Keep singing, Dr. Chen whispered, checking the cub's pulse. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. They sang through the night, hymn after hymn, their voices growing hoarse but never stopping. When Samuel's voice began to fail, Jonas took over. When Jonas tired, Rebecca picked up the melody. Even Dr. Chen hummed along to melodies she didn't know, adding her voice to the chorus of hope. As the first light of dawn touched the barn windows, exactly 24 hours after Samuel had found the cubs, Esther opened her eyes. They were clear, bright, and focused on Samuel's face. She made a small sound, not of distress but of hunger. "She wants her bottle," Samuel laughed, tears streaming down his face. "She wants to eat." Dr. Chen quickly prepared formula while checking Esther's vitals. Her fever's broken. Heart rate is stabilizing. Medically, this doesn't make sense. Faith rarely does, Rebecca said softly. As Esther drank, slowly but steadily, Moses and David crowded close, touching their sister with their noses as if to assure themselves she was really there. Thunder nickered softly, a sound of pure contentment. "You know this changes everything," Jonas said quietly to Samuel. "You can't hide them now. Too many people know or suspect. The bishop will have to be told." Samuel nodded, exhaustion and relief making him honest. "I know, but at least they're alive. Whatever comes next, they're alive." Dr. Chen began packing her supplies, moving slowly from lack of sleep. "Samuel, what you did tonight, what all of you did. I've been a vet for 15 years. I've seen animals survive against impossible odds. But this," she shook her head, "this was something else. It was community," Rebecca said simply. "It's what we do, we help each other, even when that other has 4 legs and fur." As the sun rose fully, bathing the farm in golden light, Samuel looked at his small, unlikely family. 3 bear cubs, who shouldn't be alive, a horse who had appointed himself their guardian, a community that had risked their standing to help. And somehow, in the middle of it all, a miracle. But Jonas was right. The real challenge was just beginning. Bishop Stoltzfus would not be as easily swayed as his neighbors. The laws of Pennsylvania wouldn't bend for faith and compassion, and 3 cubs wouldn't stay small forever. Samuel pushed those worries aside for now. Today, Esther was alive, Moses was healing, David was adapting, Thunder had found a new purpose, and Samuel himself had discovered something he hadn't known he'd lost. A sense of calling that went beyond the routine of farm life. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether to God, to Dr. Chen, to his neighbors, or to all of them, he wasn't sure. Esther looked up at him and made a sound that almost seemed like she was saying thank you in return. 3 days had passed since Esther's miraculous recovery, and the secret of Samuel's bears had spread through the Amish community like wildfire through dry wheat. Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before Bishop Stoltzfus arrived, and on a grey Thursday morning he saw the bishop's distinctive black buggy approaching, followed by 2 more carrying the church elders. Samuel's stomach clenched. This was not a social visit. Bishop Stoltzfus was a man who carried authority like thunder carried his harness. Naturally, without effort, as if he had been born to it. At 73 his beard had gone completely white, but his eyes remained sharp as winter ice. He had led their district for 20 years, guiding them through the challenges of maintaining their plain ways in an increasingly modern world. "Samuel Yoder," the bishop said as he stepped down from his buggy, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, barely held in check. "We need to speak." The elders, Abram Fisher and Joseph Graber, flanked the bishop like austere shadows. Neither man smiled, though Samuel caught something in Joseph's eyes that might have been sympathy. Joseph had lost a son to cancer. 2 years ago he understood something about unexpected mercy. "Bishop," Samuel said respectfully, bowing his head slightly. "Elders, would you like to come inside? What we have to discuss concerns what's in your barn," Bishop Stoltzfus said bluntly. "We'll speak there." Samuel led them to the barn, his heart heavy, but his resolve unchanged. Thunder nickered a greeting, but the 3 men barely glanced at the horse. Their attention was fixed on the stall where Moses, David, and Esther were playing. Yes, playing, with a rope toy Samuel had made them. The cubs froze when they saw the strangers. Moses immediately positioned himself in front of his siblings, his small body trying to look threatening, despite the healing wound on his shoulder. David pressed against the back wall, favoring his splintered paw. But it was Esther who surprised everyone. She walked forward, right up to the stall door, and sat down, looking up at the bishop with those impossibly expressive eyes. Bishop Stoltzfus stared at the cubs for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Bears," he said finally, the single word carrying volumes of disapproval. "You've brought wild bears into our community." "Orphaned cubs," Samuel corrected gently. "Injured and dying." "I couldn't." "You couldn't leave nature to take its course," the bishop interrupted. "You couldn't trust in God's plan." "With respect, Bishop, perhaps God's plan included me finding them. Perhaps he wanted them saved." Abram Fisher made a disapproving sound. "Pride, Samuel Yoder. You presume to know God's will." "No more than anyone who claims these cubs should have been left to die," Samuel replied, surprised by his own boldness. The barn fell silent except for Thunder's restless shifting and Esther's small chirping sound. She had apparently decided the bishop wasn't a threat and was now trying to climb the stall door, wanting to investigate these new visitors. "They're dangerous," Bishop Stoltzfus said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier harshness as he watched Esther's clumsy attempts to climb. "They'll grow large, wild. They could hurt someone." "Thunder could hurt someone," Samuel pointed out. "Any of our bulls could. Our dogs could turn vicious, but we trust in our ability to raise them right, to show them love and boundaries. These are not domestic animals, Samuel. Neither were the first wolves that became dogs or the aurochs that became cattle. Someone somewhere had to be the first to show kindness to a wild creature." Joseph Graber stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping the stall door. David had crept forward, curious about this new person, and Joseph slowly extended his hand. David sniffed it carefully, then licked Joseph's fingers with his small pink tongue. "They seem gentle," Joseph said softly, wonder creeping into his voice. "They're babies," Samuel said. "They know only what we teach them. If we teach them fear and violence, that's what they'll become. If we teach them gentleness and trust—" "You speak of them as if they're children," Bishop Stoltzfus observed. "Aren't all of God's creatures his children?" The bishop was quiet for a long moment, watching as Moses finally decided the visitors weren't threats, and joined David in investigating Joseph's outstretched hand. Esther had given up trying to climb and was now playing with a piece of straw, pouncing on it with deadly seriousness that would have been terrifying if she weren't so tiny. "The English law," Abram Fisher said suddenly. "It's illegal to keep wild animals without permit. You could bring trouble to our entire community." "Dr. Chen is working on that," Samuel said, though he knew it was a weak argument. "She has connections with wildlife rehabilitation centers. She's trying to get temporary custody papers. And if she fails—" Samuel didn't answer. He couldn't. The thought of losing the cubs now after everything was unbearable. Rebecca Miller chose that moment to arrive, carrying her medicinal basket. She stopped short when she saw the bishop and elders, but quickly recovered her composure. "Bishop," she said respectfully. "Elders, I've come to help with the cubs' medical care." "You support this?" Bishop Stoltzfus asked her. Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "I support compassion, Bishop. I support life. These cubs were suffering, and Samuel showed them mercy. Isn't that what we're called to do?" "We're called to live separate from the world," Abram countered. "To maintain our ways without interference. And yet we sell our goods to the English, use their hospitals when our children are sick, rely on their laws to protect our right to live as we choose." Rebecca replied calmly. "We've never been as separate as we pretend, Abram. We simply choose which connections to acknowledge." The barn door opened again, and Jonas Byler entered, followed by his wife Martha and their teenage son Benjamin. Then came the Zimmerman brothers, and behind them, Mary Lapp with her 3 daughters. Within minutes, the barn was filled with nearly 20 members of their community. "We heard the bishop was here," Jonas said simply. "We wanted him to know that Samuel isn't alone in this." Bishop Stoltzfus looked around at the gathered faces, some of the most respected members of their district. "You all support this foolishness." "We support Samuel," Martha Byler said firmly. "He's shown us something we'd forgotten, that mercy doesn't always follow rules." Young Benjamin Byler, barely 16, stepped forward nervously. "Bishop, may I share something?" The bishop nodded, though his expression remained stern. "Last year, when my sister died," Benjamin's voice cracked slightly, "I was angry at God, at everyone. I couldn't understand why he would take her. She was only 12. He paused, gathering himself. "Yesterday I came here to see the cubs. The smallest one, Esther. She was still weak, but when she saw me, she crawled over and put her paw on my hand. Just sat there, like she knew I was sad." Benjamin wiped his eyes. "I know it sounds foolish, but in that moment, I felt peace. Like maybe God was telling me that he cares about all his creatures' pain, that nothing is too small for his notice. If he could send Samuel to save 3 orphaned cubs, maybe he was with my sister too, at the end." The barn was silent. Even Abram Fisher seemed moved by the boy's words. Bishop Stoltzfus walked slowly to the stall. Moses, David, and Esther looked up at him, no longer afraid. The bishop studied them for a long moment, then did something that shocked everyone. He reached into the stall and gently stroked Moses's head. "My grandfather," the bishop said quietly, "told me a story once. In the old country before we came to America, there was a terrible winter. The wolves came down from the mountains, starving, desperate. Most villages set traps, organized hunts. But one Amish community chose differently. They left food at the forest's edge, their own precious stores, though they had little to spare." He continued, stroking Moses, who had begun to purr, a sound Samuel hadn't known bears could make. "The other villagers called them fools, said the wolves would grow bold, attack their livestock, their children. But that winter, not one wolf entered that village. They stayed in the forest, fed by the community's mercy. And when spring came, those wolves kept other predators away from the village's flocks all summer, as if they remembered the kindness." The bishop withdrew his hand and turned to face the gathered community. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have become so focused on maintaining our separation from the world that we've forgotten what we're meant to be separate for, to show a different way, a kinder way." Abram Fisher shifted uncomfortably. "Bishop, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting, Abram, that rules without mercy are just chains, and chains were never Christ's way." The bishop looked at Samuel. "You've taken on a heavy burden, Samuel Yoder. These cubs will need constant care, will pose challenges we cannot foresee. The English authorities may still intervene. I understand, Bishop. Do you understand that if these cubs harm anyone at all, the responsibility will be yours, that the entire community could suffer for your choice?" "I do." Bishop Stoltzfus was quiet for a moment, then made a decision that would be debated in the district for years to come. "Then we will help you bear this burden. The community will support you, as is our way. But," he raised a finger in warning, "there will be conditions." Samuel's heart leaped. "Anything, Bishop. First, Dr. Chen must succeed in getting legal permission. We will not harbor illegal animals and bring the English law down upon us. Second, the cubs must be kept secure. Proper fencing, stronger stalls as they grow. The community will help with the construction. Third, if they show any sign of aggression toward humans, we will revisit this decision." "I agree to all conditions," Samuel said quickly. "And fourth," the bishop continued, his eyes twinkling slightly, "you must allow our children to visit them. If we're to have bears in our midst, perhaps our young ones can learn something about God's diverse creation." The barn erupted in surprised murmurs. Bishop Stoltzfus, the strict interpreter of the Ordnung, was not only allowing the cubs to stay, but encouraging the community to embrace them. "Bishop," Joseph Graber said carefully, "what will we tell the other districts? This is unprecedented." "We will tell them the truth," Bishop Stoltzfus replied, "that the Amish have always been caretakers of the land and its creatures. That showing mercy to orphans, regardless of species, is not a violation of our beliefs, but a confirmation of them," as if understanding the momentous decision that had just been made. Esther chose that moment to finally succeed in climbing the stall door. She tumbled into the bishop's arms, surprised by her own success. Instead of dropping her or backing away, Bishop Stoltzfus held her carefully, looking into her eyes with wonder. "So small," he murmured. "So trusting." He looked at Samuel. "You've been calling her Esther." "Yes, Bishop, a good name. Queen Esther saved her people through courage and faith. Perhaps this little Esther will save us from forgetting that our rules should serve love, not the other way around." He handed Esther to Samuel, then addressed the gathered community. "Let it be known that the Yoder farm is now under the protection and support of this district. We will help with feeding, construction, whatever is needed. But remember, this is not a precedent for keeping wild animals. This is a special circumstance, a unique calling that Samuel has accepted. We support him not because we approve of bears in barns, but because we approve of mercy wherever it's needed." As the bishop and elders prepared to leave, Abram Fisher lingered. He had been the strongest voice against the cubs, but now he stood at the stall, watching David attempt to play despite his splintered paw. "My grandson," Abram said quietly to Samuel, "has never spoken. 4 years old, and not a word. The doctors say he may never speak. Would it be possible for him to meet them? Sometimes animals reach children in ways we cannot." "Of course, Abram, bring him any time." Abram nodded, his stern face softening. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge." Pride comes in many forms, including the pride of always being right. After everyone left, Samuel sat in the stall with the cubs, overwhelmed by the turn of events. Moses was investigating the bishop's walking stick, which had been forgotten in the corner. David was practicing walking with his splint, determined to keep up with his siblings, and Esther was curled in Samuel's lap, finally sleeping peacefully after her climbing adventure. Thunder leaned over the stall door, and Samuel reached up to stroke his faithful friend's nose. "We did it, boy. Somehow we did it." But even as relief flooded through him, Samuel knew this was just the beginning. The cubs were growing rapidly. Already they were noticeably larger than when he'd found them just days ago. In a few months they would be too large for the stall. In a year they would be powerful enough to be truly dangerous if not properly trained and contained. And there was still the matter of the law. Dr. Chen had been working tirelessly to navigate the bureaucratic maze of wildlife regulations, but success was far from guaranteed. The Pennsylvania Game Commission was notoriously strict about wild animal custody, and the fact that Samuel was Amish might work against him. Some officials saw the plain people as backward, incapable of providing proper care for exotic animals. That evening, Chen arrived with a mixture of hope and concern on her face. "I've got news," she said, setting down her medical bag, "both good and bad." Samuel steeled himself. "Tell me." "The good news is that I've found a legal pathway. There's a provision for licensed wildlife rehabilitators to designate assistant caretakers for animals that require long-term care. I'm licensed and I can designate you as my assistant. And the bad news? An inspector from the Game Commission is coming tomorrow. If the setup doesn't meet their standards, if they think the cubs are in danger or are a danger to others, they'll confiscate them immediately." Samuel's heart sank. The stall that had seemed adequate for 3 small cubs would never pass official inspection. They needed proper enclosures, safety protocols, documentation, all things that would take weeks to properly prepare. "Then we worked through the night." Rebecca's voice came from the doorway. She entered, followed by Jonas, Martha, and a dozen other community members. "We heard Dr. Chen's truck arrive, figured you might need help." "But it's past sunset," Samuel protested. "You all have farms to tend in the morning, and you have bears to save." Jonas interrupted, "Which apparently is now our community's business. Benjamin, run home and get the lumber from our barn. Abraham, Isaac will need your welding equipment." "Welding?" Abraham Zimmerman asked, confused. "But we don't use." "Tonight we do," Jonas said firmly, "unless you can build bear-proof enclosures with wood alone." As the community sprang into action, Samuel marveled at the transformation. These people, who normally viewed any deviation from tradition with suspicion, were embracing change for the sake of 3 orphaned cubs. Through the night, they worked, the Amish and Dr. Chen side by side, building something that had never existed before, an enclosure that met state requirements while respecting Amish simplicity. No electric fencing, but double-layered wood and metal barriers that even grown bears couldn't breach. No modern monitoring equipment, but clever placement that allowed constant observation from multiple angles. Dawn broke over Lancaster County with a spectacular display of crimson and gold, as if the sky itself was acknowledging the monumental effort that had taken place through the night. Samuel stood beside the newly constructed enclosure, his clothes covered in sawdust and dirt, his hands raw from hours of work, but his heart filled with a pride he knew he should probably pray about later. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a simple barn stall was now a professional-grade wildlife habitat. The main enclosure stretched 30 feet by 40 feet, with walls of reinforced oak planks backed by steel mesh that Abraham and Isaac had somehow procured and installed without questioning their usual prohibition against such modern materials. There were 3 separate sleeping dens, each lined with fresh straw and designed to accommodate growing bears. A shallow pool made from an old cattle trough provided water for drinking and playing. Climbing structures built from fallen trees gave the cubs opportunities for exercise and exploration, but it was the details that truly showed the community's investment. Martha Byler had sewn heavy canvas covers for sharp corners. Young Benjamin had created an ingenious double-gate system that allowed feeding without direct contact. Rebecca had organized a medical station with all of Dr. Chen's supplies properly stored and labeled. Even old Elizabeth King had contributed, sending her grandson with a hand-painted sign that read, "Samuel's Sanctuary," in beautiful German script. The cubs, exhausted from supervising all the nighttime activity, were curled together in one of the new dens. Moses had his good paw draped protectively over Esther, while David snored softly despite his splintered leg. They looked so peaceful, so innocent, that Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "They don't know how close they came to losing everything," Chen said softly, approaching with 2 cups of Rebecca's strong coffee. She looked as tired as Samuel felt, having worked alongside the Amish all night while simultaneously preparing documentation for the inspector. "Perhaps it's better they don't know," Samuel replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Fear serves no purpose for creatures that live in the moment." Thunder, who had been remarkably patient with all the construction chaos, nickered from his stall. The horse had refused to leave the barn during the work, maintaining his self-appointed guardian role even as hammers rang and saws buzzed around him. "The inspector will be here at 9, Dr. Chen said, checking her watch. "His name is Marcus Rodriguez. He's not known for being sympathetic to unusual situations." "Then we'll have to make the situation seem as usual as possible," Samuel said with a wry smile. "Though I'm not sure how usual 3 bear cubs in an Amish barn can ever appear." The community members who had worked through the night were beginning to head home to tend their own farms, but not before each stopped to offer Samuel encouragement. Jonas clasped his shoulder firmly, Martha kissed his cheek like a mother would, and even stern Abram Fisher managed a nod of approval. Bishop Stoltzfus arrived just as the last helpers were leaving. He surveyed the enclosure with his penetrating gaze, taking in every detail. "You've built something impressive here, Samuel," he said finally, "but buildings don't raise bears. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "I'm prepared to learn, Bishop, to make mistakes and correct them, to do whatever these cubs need. And if what they need is to be wild, if keeping them here becomes cruel, no matter how kind your intentions." Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching as Esther stirred in her sleep, one paw twitching as she dreamed. "Then I'll let them go, no matter how much it breaks my heart." The bishop nodded, satisfied. "That's the answer I hope to hear. Love that cannot release its hold becomes possession, not affection." He turned to leave, then paused. "I'll be praying for a favorable outcome with this inspector. We all will." At exactly 9 o'clock, A dark green truck with the Pennsylvania Game Commission logo pulled into the farmyard. The man who emerged was everything Samuel had feared: official, stern, carrying a clipboard like a weapon, and wearing an expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind. Marcus Rodriguez was in his 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore his uniform like armor, and his first words were not encouraging. "Mr. Yoder, I'm here to inspect the illegal wildlife you've been harboring." "They're not illegal," Chen interjected quickly, stepping forward with a folder of documents. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, licensed wildlife rehabilitator, and I've designated Mr. Yoder as my assistant caretaker under Provision 4.3, although I'm familiar with the provision, Doctor," Rodriguez interrupted. "I'm also familiar with people trying to use loopholes to keep exotic pets." He looked at Samuel with barely concealed disdain, especially people who think their religious beliefs somehow exempt them from the law. Samuel felt his temper flare but forced it down. "My beliefs tell me to show mercy to all of God's creatures, Mr. Rodriguez. That's what I'm doing here." "We'll see about that." Rodriguez pulled out his clipboard. "Show me these bears." They walked to the enclosure, where the cubs were now awake and playing. Moses was attempting to climb one of the log structures, despite his healing shoulder. David was splashing in the pool, and Esther was stalking a butterfly that had wandered into the enclosure. Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but Samuel caught him watching Esther's clumsy hunting attempts for longer than necessary. "How did you come to possess these animals?" Samuel told the story simply, without embellishment. The foggy morning, the dead mother, the dying cubs. Rodriguez took notes, occasionally interrupting with questions. "How long had the mother been dead? Did you see any signs of what killed her? Why didn't you immediately contact the Game Commission?" "I was focused on saving their lives," Samuel answered honestly. "Reporting them could wait, their survival couldn't." Rodriguez examined the enclosure thoroughly, checking every joint, every lock, every safety measure. He reviewed Dr. Chen's medical records, inspected the food storage, questioned the feeding schedule. He took photographs from multiple angles and measured distances with a laser device that made Samuel uncomfortable with its modern precision. "The enclosure is adequate," Rodriguez admitted grudgingly. "Better than many I've seen at licensed facilities, but keeping wild bears isn't just about infrastructure. It's about long-term planning. What happens when they're full-grown? When they're 500 pounds each? We'll expand as needed," Samuel said. "The community has pledged its support." "The community?" Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Your people don't even use electricity. How can you properly care for animals that might need advanced veterinary procedures?" "The same way we've cared for our livestock for 300 years, Samuel replied calmly. "With attention, dedication, and help from skilled professionals like Dr. Chen, when needed." Rodriguez was about to respond when Esther did something unexpected. She had noticed the inspector and, with the fearlessness of youth, ambled over to the fence where he stood. She sat down directly in front of him and tilted her head, as if studying this stern man who held her fate in his hands. Then she did something even more remarkable. She reached her paw through the fence, not aggressively, but gently, the same way she reached for Samuel when she wanted comfort. It was a gesture so human, so trusting, that even Rodriguez seemed taken aback. "She's never done that with a stranger before," Dr. Chen said softly. Rodriguez stared at the little paw extended toward him. Slowly, as if against his better judgment, he knelt and touched Esther's paw with one finger. Esther chirped, that unique sound she made when happy, and tried to grasp his finger. "How old are they?" Rodriguez asked, his voice different now, less official. "We estimate 6 months," Dr. Chen replied. "Maybe 7. They should be afraid of humans. Wild cubs at this age are naturally wary. They've known only kindness from humans," Samuel said. "Fear isn't natural, it's learned." Rodriguez stood abruptly, as if remembering his role. "This complicates things. Bears that have no fear of humans are often the most dangerous. or the most capable of coexistence, Samuel suggested. If we teach them boundaries with love rather than fear. Rodriguez returned to his clipboard, but Samuel noticed his eyes kept drifting back to the cubs. Moses had now succeeded in climbing to the top of the highest log and was surveying his kingdom with obvious pride. David had discovered that splashing in the pool created interesting patterns and was experimenting with different paw movements. And Esther remained at the fence, still watching the inspector with those impossibly expressive eyes. "I need to make some calls," Rodriguez said finally. "This situation is unusual." He walked back to his truck, phone pressed to his ear. Samuel could see him gesturing as he talked, occasionally looking back at the enclosure. Dr. Chen stood beside Samuel, tension radiating from her small frame. "What do you think?" Samuel asked quietly. "I think Esther might have just saved the day," she replied. "But we won't know until—" Rodriguez was returning, his expression unreadable. He stood before them, clipboard at his side, and seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "In my 15 years with the Game Commission," he began, "I've seen every kind of wildlife violation imaginable. People keeping eagles in apartments, alligators in bathtubs, wolves in suburban backyards. It always ends badly. Always." He paused, looking directly at Samuel. "But this is different." Samuel's heart began to hope. The enclosure exceeds minimum standards. The medical care has been exemplary. The cubs are thriving, better than many in professional facilities, and the community support. He gestured toward the farm, where several buggies had gathered, their occupants watching anxiously. "I've never seen anything like it." "So they can stay?" Samuel asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Conditionally." Rodriguez pulled out a formal-looking document. "This is a provisional wildlife custody permit. It's good for 6 months. During that time, there will be monthly inspection. Any sign of aggression, any injury to a human, any escape, and the cubs will be immediately confiscated. Additionally, you'll need to complete a wildlife management course. Dr. Chen can arrange that. And as the cubs grow, the enclosure must be expanded accordingly." Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief. "We'll meet every requirement. You have my word." "I'm not finished," Rodriguez said, though his tone had softened. "There's one more condition, and it's non-negotiable. When these bears reach maturity, approximately 2 years old, they must be evaluated for potential release back into the wild. If they're deemed capable of survival, they must be released. No exceptions." Samuel's heart clenched. 2 years. It seemed like forever and no time at all, but he nodded. "I understand." Rodriguez handed him the permit. "Mr. Yoder, what you're doing here goes against everything I was trained to believe." But he looked back at the cubs, where Esther was now trying to climb the fence to follow him. Sometimes training has to yield to evidence. These cubs are thriving. That's what matters. As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he did something unexpected. He walked back to the enclosure, knelt at the fence, and let Esther grasp his finger properly this time. "Take care of them," he said to Samuel. "They're special. All of God's creatures are special, Mr. Rodriguez." The inspector smiled. The first time he'd done so since arriving, perhaps, but some remind us of that truth more than others. After Rodriguez's truck disappeared down the road, the community erupted in celebration. Rebecca actually hugged Dr. Chen. Cultural barriers forgotten. In the moment of joy, Jonas whooped loud enough to startle the chickens. Even Bishop Stoltzfus allowed himself a small smile. But it was Thunder's reaction that moved Samuel most. The great horse walked to the enclosure, lowered his head where the cubs could reach, and let them nuzzle him through the fence. It was as if he understood that his small friends were safe, at least for now. That evening, as Samuel sat in the enclosure with the cubs climbing over him like a living jungle gym, he thought about Rodriguez's final condition. 2 years to love them, raise them, teach them. 2 years before he might have to let them go. Moses was chewing on his bootlace. David had discovered that Samuel's hat made an excellent toy, and Esther was curled in his lap, her paw wrapped around his thumb as she slept. 2 years, he whispered to them, We'll make them count. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A small car pulled up, and a young Amish boy emerged, or rather, was carried out by his grandfather, Abram Fisher. This was the grandson Abram had mentioned, the 4-year-old who had never spoke. The boy, named Timothy, was beautiful in the way that children untouched by the world's harshness often are. His eyes were bright and intelligent, but his mouth remained firmly closed, as it had since birth. "May we see them?" Abram asked softly, his usual sternness replaced by grandfatherly concern. Samuel led them to the enclosure. The cubs were active, playing a game that seemed to involve Moses hiding and his siblings finding him. When they saw the visitors, Moses and David approached cautiously, but Esther, true to form, came right to the fence. Timothy's eyes widened. He had seen animals before, horses, cows, chickens, but never anything like these cubs. Esther sat directly in front of him, tilting her head in that questioning way she had. Then, without warning, Timothy laughed. It wasn't speech, but it was sound, the first voluntary sound he'd ever made. Abram's eyes filled with tears as his grandson laughed again, reaching through the fence to touch Esther's fur. "Bear," Timothy said suddenly, the German word for bear coming out clear and distinct. "Bear." Abram nearly collapsed. He looked at Samuel with an expression of such gratitude that words weren't necessary. His grandson had spoken. The child who doctors said might never communicate had found his voice in the presence of a bear cub named Esther. Word of Timothy's breakthrough spread quickly. Soon other families were bringing children to see the cubs, not just for entertainment, but for healing. A girl with anxiety found peace watching David's methodical play. A boy recovering from a farm accident gained confidence, seeing Moses navigate with his injured shoulder. And Esther seemed to have a gift for finding the children who needed her most. She would ignore a crowd to sit beside a withdrawn child, would play gently with those who were fragile, would be silly with those who needed to laugh. Jen documented everything, creating a record that would later become part of a study on animal-assisted therapy. But for Samuel and his community, no scientific explanation was needed. They had witnessed something sacred, the mysterious way God's creatures could heal each other across the boundaries of species. As autumn deepened toward winter, the cubs grew rapidly. Their baby fur was replaced by thicker, darker coats. Moses's shoulder healed completely, leaving only a small scar. David's paw mended straight and strong, and Esther, once the weakest, became the most adventurous, always finding new ways to explore their enclosure. Samuel expanded their space as promised, adding winter shelters and more complex climbing structures. The community donated time, materials and money, something almost unheard of in their frugal society. But the cubs had become more than just Samuel's project. They had become a symbol of their community's capacity for growth, for adapting their traditions without abandoning them. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Lancaster County in pristine white 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Samuel woke to find the world transformed, and the cubs experiencing their first real taste of winter. Through the Dern window he could see them in their enclosure, and the sight made him laugh out loud. Despite the early hour, Moses had apparently discovered snow was edible and was attempting to eat his way through a drift. David was conducting what appeared to be a scientific experiment, carefully placing his paw in the snow, lifting it to examine the print, then placing it again. But Esther had discovered that snow was for playing. She was rolling, tumbling, throwing pawfuls in the air and trying to catch them, her joy so pure and infectious that even thunder was prancing in his adjacent pasture. But with the snow came challenges Samuel hadn't fully anticipated. The cubs' appetite had tripled as their bodies prepared for what would have been hibernation in the wild. Dr. Chen explained that while captive bears don't truly hibernate, they do slow down in winter, eating massive amounts to build fat reserves. "We're going through 50 pounds of food a day," Samuel told Jonas one morning as they unloaded another delivery of fish, fruits and vegetables, foods that were expensive and hard to come by in Amish country in winter. The community fund is holding, Jonas assured him, though Samuel caught the worry in his friend's eyes. They had already spent more maintaining the cubs than most families spent in a year. The real crisis came in early December. A brutal cold snap descended, temperatures plummeting to near zero. The cubs' shelters, while sturdy, weren't warm enough for such extreme cold. Samuel found them huddled together one morning, shivering despite their thick fur, and Esther was coughing, a sound that sent fear straight through his heart. "We need heaters," Chan said firmly after examining them. "I know it goes against your ways, but no electricity," Samuel said, though the words pained him. "There has to be another way." The solution came from an unexpected source. Old Eli Lapp, Mary's father-in-law, remembered something from his youth. "My grandfather kept bees," he said, stroking his long white beard. In the old country they would build warming houses for the hives in winter, not with electricity, but with clever design and shared heat. Working from Eli's memories and sketches, the community constructed an ingenious system. They built a central fire pit with a chimney system that ran under the cubs' shelters, warming the floor from beneath. Vents could be adjusted to control the temperature, and the smoke was directed away from the enclosure. It was primitive by English standards, but effective. The cubs thrived in their newly warmed space, but the construction had drawn attention. A reporter from the Lancaster newspaper had heard about the Amish bear cubs and arrived one morning with a photographer, eager for what she called a heartwarming holiday story. Samuel refused to speak with them, as did most of the community. But the reporter was persistent, parking outside the farm and taking photos with a long lens. The story that ran the next day was respectful enough. Amish community rallies to save orphaned bears. But it opened floodgates Samuel hadn't expected. Within days, cars full of English tourists were driving slowly past the farm, trying to catch glimpses of the cubs. Some were respectful, but others were intrusive, walking onto the property uninvited, trying to take selfies at the enclosure fence. One group actually tried to feed the cubs candy through the fence, not understanding the danger to both bears and humans. "This has to stop," Bishop Stoltzfus said firmly after a particularly chaotic Sunday when tourists had disrupted their worship service. "The English attention threatens our way of life." Samuel knew the bishop was right, but what could he do? He couldn't move the cubs, and he couldn't control the English fascination with what they saw as a novelty. The solution came from Marcus Rodriguez, who arrived for his monthly inspection to find the farm overrun with tourists. His face darkened with anger. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, watching a family trying to coax Esther to the fence for a photo. "These bears are becoming habituated to human presence. It's dangerous for everyone." But instead of using this as grounds to remove the cubs, Rodriguez did something unexpected. He called the local police and had them establish a perimeter. Then he posted official Game Commission signs: "Wildlife rehabilitation in progress. No unauthorized entry. Violators will be prosecuted." "The cubs need peace to develop properly," he told Samuel, "and your community deserves respect. I'll make sure you get both." The signs and occasional police patrols helped, but the December inspection brought new concerns. The cubs had grown dramatically. Moses now weighed nearly 100 pounds, and even little Esther was approaching 70. Rodriguez watched them carefully, making notes. "They're healthy," he said, "but they're also becoming more bear-like. Look at how Moses responded when David approached his food." That was a warning growl. "And Esther's play is getting rougher." Samuel had noticed too. The cubs were still gentle with him and the regular caregivers, but their play with each other was increasingly violent-looking, though Dr. Chen assured him it was normal bear behavior. "They're teenagers now, in bear terms," she explained. "Testing boundaries, establishing dominance. It's actually a good sign. It means they're developing normal bear behaviors despite being hand-raised." But normal bear behaviors were exactly what worried Samuel. How could he prepare them for possible release while keeping them safe in captivity? It was a balance he struggled with daily. The answer came from an unexpected source: Thunder. The great horse had never stopped his vigilance over the cubs, and they had developed an extraordinary relationship. Samuel watched one day as Moses got too rough with Esther, bowling her over with a swipe that was harder than play. Thunder immediately nickered sharply, a sound Samuel had never heard him make, and Moses immediately backed off, looking almost ashamed. "He's disciplining them," Dr. Chen said in amazement. "He's teaching them boundaries." It was true. Thunder had become not just their guardian, but their teacher. When they played too rough, he corrected them. When they were calm, he rewarded them with his presence, often lying down beside the fence so they could sleep against his warm bulk. Christmas approached with its usual quiet reverence in the Amish community. No trees or lights, but special meals, family gatherings, and reflection on God's gifts. Samuel decided the cubs deserved their own celebration and worked with Dr. Chen to create special enrichment activities: frozen treats with berries inside, new toys made from natural materials, fresh straw that smelled of summer. On Christmas Eve, the community gathered for a special service. To Samuel's surprise, Bishop Stoltefus asked him to share a reflection. Standing before his neighbors, Samuel spoke from his heart. "These cubs have taught me that God's love doesn't follow our human boundaries. They've shown me that family isn't just about blood or even species. It's about choosing to care for each other, to protect each other, to help each other grow strong enough to face whatever comes." He paused, looking at the faces before him, some tearful, others thoughtful. "I don't know if the cubs will stay or if they'll return to the wild, but I know that their presence here has changed us. We've remembered that our calling isn't just to separate ourselves from the world, but to show the world a different way of being, a way that includes mercy for all creatures." After the service, families quietly visited the cubs, bringing their children to see how much they'd grown. Timothy, Abram's grandson, was now talking regularly, though he saved his most animated conversations for Esther. He stood at the fence, telling her in a mix of Pennsylvania Pidginish and English about his Christmas preparations, and Esther listened with what seemed like genuine interest. But it was what happened that night, after everyone had gone home, that Samuel would remember forever. He went to check on the cubs one last time before bed, and found them arranged in an unusual pattern. They were sitting in a row, Moses, David, and Esther, facing Thunder's stall. The horse was standing perfectly still, his head lowered toward them. In the moonlight streaming through the barn windows, it looked almost like a nativity scene, different species gathered in a barn, sharing a moment of perfect peace. Samuel sat quietly on a hay bale, watching this tableau. He thought about Mary and Joseph in a stable, about creatures bearing witness to the divine, about the mysterious ways God revealed himself through the humble and unexpected. His reverie was broken by the sound of a car engine. Chen's pickup pulled into the yard, unusual for Christmas Eve, near midnight. Her face when she emerged told him something was wrong. "Samuel, I just got a call from a colleague at the Wildlife Center in Harrisburg. There's been an incident. A mother bear and 2 cubs were hit by a truck on Route 30. The mother and 1 cub died, but 1 cub survived. It's badly injured, maybe 6 months old." Samuel's heart clenched. Another orphaned cub, another life hanging in the balance. "They want to euthanize it," Dr. Chen continued. "The injuries are severe, and they don't have the resources for long-term rehabilitation. But I thought, if you're willing..." Samuel looked back at his 3 cubs, now alert and watching him through the fence. Could he take on another injured cub? Did he have the right to make that decision? As if sensing his dilemma, Esther stood and walked to the fence. She made a soft whuffing sound, the sound mother bears make to call their cubs. It was the first time she'd made that particular vocalization. "Bring the cub," Samuel said quietly. "We'll find room." Chen left immediately for the 2-hour drive to Harrisburg. Samuel began preparing a quarantine area in a separate part of the barn. The new cub would need isolation initially, both for medical care and to prevent disease transmission. He worked through the night, and Thunder stayed awake with him, occasionally nickering encouragement. The three cubs remained unusually quiet, as if they understood something momentous was happening. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Chen returned. The cub she carried was even smaller than Esther had been, and in terrible condition. Its left rear leg was mangled, its breathing labored, and multiple lacerations covered its small body. But it was alive, and its eyes, frightened but fierce, showed a will to survive. "It's a female," Chen said, immediately beginning medical treatment. The vet at the center did initial stabilization, but she needs surgery on that leg. "I can do it here, but Samuel, even if she survives, she'll likely never walk normally. She could never be released to the wild." Samuel looked at the tiny broken cub fighting for each breath. He thought of Esther fighting her pneumonia, of David learning to walk with his splintered paw, of Moses climbing despite his wounded shoulder. "Then she'll have a permanent home here," he said firmly, "for as long as she needs it." As Dr. Chen worked to save the new cub's life, Samuel heard a commotion from the enclosure. His three cubs were pressed against the fence, all making the same whuffing sound Esther had made earlier, calling to the injured cub, welcoming her, telling her she wasn't alone. The surgery took 3 hours. Dr. Chen had to amputate part of the mangled leg, leaving the cub with a stump that would never support normal bear activities. But the cub, whom Samuel had already begun thinking of as Ruth, after the biblical woman who found a new family in a strange land, survived. When Ruth woke from anesthesia, the first thing she heard was the calling of the other cubs. Despite her pain and fear, she responded with a weak cry of her own. It was the beginning of something new, something that would test Samuel's community even further, but would also reveal depths of compassion they didn't know they possessed. The news of the fourth cub spread quickly through the district. Some questioned the wisdom of taking on another burden, especially one so damaged. But when Bishop Stoltzfus came to see Ruth, tiny and bandaged in her medical pen, he said simply, "God doesn't send us only the whole and healthy to care for. Sometimes he sends us the broken to teach us that we're all broken in some way." By New Year's Day, Ruth was stable enough to be introduced to the other cubs through a fence barrier. The meeting was extraordinary. Moses approached first, sniffing carefully, then made a soft sound Samuel had never heard from him, almost like purring. David came next, sitting quietly beside the fence, as if standing guard. But it was Esther who did something remarkable. Esther found one of her favorite toys, a ball made of rope that she'd had since her first days, and pushed it through the fence to Ruth. The injured cub, still weak and uncertain, touched the toy tentatively, then pulled it close. It was the first time since the accident that she showed interest in anything beyond survival. "They're accepting her," Dr. Chen said in wonder. "I've never seen cubs this accepting of a stranger, especially an injured one." "They remember," Samuel said quietly. "They remember being alone and hurt. They won't let her feel that way." The winter deepened, bringing challenges and blessings in equal measure. Ruth's recovery was slow but steady. She learned to move on 3 legs with surprising agility, and the other cubs adjusted their play to accommodate her limitations. Moses became protective, always positioning himself between Ruth and any perceived threat. David shared his food with her, pushing the best pieces in her direction. And Esther became her constant companion, the 2 smallest cubs forming a bond that transcended their traumatic beginnings. The community, initially skeptical about taking on a permanently disabled cub, rallied once again. Special ramps were built so Ruth could access all areas of the enclosure. A smaller pool was added at ground level so she could enjoy water without having to climb. Timothy, the once silent boy, appointed himself Ruth's special friend, visiting daily to tell her stories and sing her the simple songs his grandmother taught him. Marcus Rodriguez's January inspection brought an unexpected development. He watched the 4 cubs for a long time, paying special attention to how the three original cubs had modified their behavior to include Ruth. "This is unprecedented," he said finally. "The social dynamics, the adaptation, the care they show for each other. I've been in wildlife management for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Mr. Yoder, would you be opposed to allowing researchers to observe the cubs? Not invasively, just documentation of their behaviors and development." Samuel's first instinct was to refuse. The cubs had already attracted too much attention, but Dr. Chen pointed out that documentation could help other orphaned and injured wildlife, could potentially change how rehabilitation was approached. "Pray about it," Bishop Stoltzfus advised when Samuel sought his counsel. "Sometimes God calls us to be examples, even when we'd prefer to remain hidden." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the Yoder farm into a paradise of green fields and blooming flowers. The cubs, now yearlings, had grown into magnificent young bears. Moses topped 200 pounds, his shoulders broad and powerful. David, despite his early injury, was just as strong, his gait showing no sign of his former broken paw. Esther had become sleek and quick, her intelligence shining in every movement. And Ruth, their miracle survivor, had adapted to her three-legged life with a grace that inspired everyone who saw her. But with spring came the approaching deadline that haunted Samuel's dreams. The 2-year mark was only months away, and Marcus Rodriguez had made it clear during his recent visits that Moses, David, and Esther were developing exactly as wild bears should. They were candidates for release. Not Ruth, obviously, Rodriguez had said during his March inspection, watching the three-legged bear navigate the enclosure with remarkable agility. "She'll need permanent sanctuary, but the others, Samuel, they're perfect. They've maintained their wild instincts while learning boundaries with humans. They could survive in the wild." The words Samuel had dreaded were finally spoken aloud. He'd known this day would come, had agreed to it, but knowing and accepting were vastly different things. That evening he sat in the enclosure with all 4 cubs, though calling them cubs anymore was a stretch. Moses lounged against his leg, a solid wall of muscle and fur. David methodically groomed his paws nearby. Ruth had her head in Samuel's lap, enjoying gentle scratches behind her ears, and Esther, always the explorer, was investigating a new log that had been added to their climbing structure, though she kept glancing back at Samuel as if to make sure he was still there. "How do I let you go?" he whispered to them. "How do I send you into a world that killed your mothers?" Thunder nickered softly from his position by the fence. The horse, now 10 years old, had been the cub's constant companion for nearly 2 years. Samuel wondered if Thunder understood what was coming, if he too was preparing for goodbye. The community had sensed the approaching change. Visits became more frequent, as if everyone wanted to store up memories. Timothy, now 6 and chattering constantly, spent hours at the enclosure, reading to the bears from the simple books his grandmother gave him. His grandfather, Abram, often stood nearby, his eyes soft with gratitude for the miracle the bears had worked in his grandson's life. "They saved him," Abram told Samuel one afternoon. "When no doctor could help, when we'd lost hope, these bears gave him his voice. How can we ever repay that?" "By letting them go if that's what's best for them," Samuel replied, though the words felt like swallowing glass. The research team Rodriguez had mentioned arrived in April, 3 graduate students from Penn State, led by a professor named Dr. Jennifer Hartley. Samuel had agreed to their presence with strict conditions: no interference with the bears' routine, no invasive procedures, and respect for the Amish community's ways. Hartley was a small woman with kind eyes, who immediately won Samuel's trust by asking permission before every observation, by learning the bears' names and personalities, by sitting quietly for hours just watching and taking notes. "What you've achieved here is remarkable," she told Samuel after a week of observation. The social bonds between these bears, their adaptation to Ruth's disability, their relationship with thunder. It's rewriting what we thought we knew about bear behavior and intelligence. They're just being themselves, Samuel said simply. Exactly, and their selves are far more complex and compassionate than we ever imagined. One evening, Dr. Hartley witnessed something that made her drop her notebook in astonishment. Ruth had been struggling to reach some fruit placed high in their feeding area, a challenge with her missing leg. Moses noticed her difficulty and did something unprecedented. He knocked the fruit down to where Ruth could reach it, then stepped back to let her eat first. That's tool use and deferred gratification and empathy all at once, Dr. Hartley breathed. Bears aren't supposed to be capable of that level of abstract thinking. Maybe, Samuel suggested gently, bears have always been capable. Maybe no one ever gave them the chance to show it. May brought the most difficult conversation yet. Rodriguez arrived with a team from the Pennsylvania Wildlife Authority, including the state's lead bear biologist. They spent 2 days evaluating Moses, David, and Esther, testing their reactions to various stimuli, assessing their health and capabilities. The verdict was unanimous. The 3 bears were perfect candidates for release. A territory had been identified in the Pocono Mountains, far from human settlement, with abundant food sources and no resident bear population to create territorial conflicts. The release would be in stages, Rodriguez alludes to Samuel and Bishop Stoltzfus. First, a large transitional enclosure in the forest where they could acclimate. Then graduated freedom, with GPS tracking to monitor their progress. We'd provide supplemental feeding initially, gradually reducing it as they learn to forage. And Ruth? Samuel asked. Ruth stays here, permanently. We'll provide official sanctuary status for your facility, specifically for her care. You'd be Pennsylvania's first Amish-run wildlife sanctuary. Bishop Stoltzfus stroked his beard thoughtfully. And if the 3 choose not to leave, if they return? Rodriguez sighed. Bears sometimes do return to where they were raised. If that happens repeatedly, we'd have to relocate them farther away or reconsider their suitability for release. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He walked to the barn where the bears were resting. They'd long outgrown the original enclosure and now had access to a full acre of secured habitat, complete with trees, caves, and a large pond Thunder liked to drink from. He found them in their favorite sleeping sort, a pile of bears that seemed impossible to distinguish where one ended and another began. Ruth was in the middle, protected by the other's bulk. Even in sleep, they took care of her. Thunder was lying nearby, just outside the fence, maintaining his eternal vigil. The horse looked at Samuel with those wise eyes that seemed to understand everything. "What would you do, old friend?" Samuel asked. Thunder whickered softly and looked toward the mountains visible in the distance. The message seemed clear. Freedom was their birthright, even if it broke the hearts of those who loved them. The community gathered for a special meeting to discuss the decision. It should have been Samuel's alone, but these bears belong to all of them now. Jonas spoke first. "They've given us so much, shouldn't we give them their freedom in return?" Martha Byler wiped tears from her eyes. "But what if something happens to them? What if they can't survive?" "Then they'll die as God intended," Bishop Stoltzfus said gently, "as wild creatures, not as captives." "Isn't that a kind of love too?" Young Benjamin, now 18, stood to speak. "I remember when we first built their enclosure. We worked through the night, all of us together. We did it to save them. Maybe letting them go is just another way of saving them." Rebecca, who had helped care for the bears from the beginning, added quietly, "Love isn't about keeping. It's about wanting what's best for the beloved, even when it hurts us." The vote was unanimous. Though tearful, the bears would be given their chance at freedom. The preparation for release took a month. The bears needed to be sedated for transport, something that had never been done before. Dr. Chen worried about their reaction to the drugs, about the stress of the journey. But she needn't have worried. When the day came, Samuel entered their enclosure one last time. He sat with them, feeding them their favorite treats, laced with mild sedatives. He talked to them constantly, telling them they were going on an adventure, that they were loved, that they would never be forgotten. Moses went under first, his massive head finally dropping into Samuel's lap. Samuel stroked the fur around the old shoulder wound, now just a faint scar. "You were so brave," he whispered. "Right from the start, you were the brave one." David followed, fighting the sedative longer, his eyes fixed on Samuel until the last moment. "And you were the determined one, never giving up, never complaining." Esther was last, and Samuel's tears fell freely as she succumbed to the drugs. "My little miracle, you taught us all so much." Ruth, who wasn't being sedated, seemed to understand something momentous was happening. She hobbled over on her 3 legs and lay beside her sleeping siblings, whimpering softly. The transport team was respectful, understanding the gravity of the moment. The entire community had gathered to say goodbye. Timothy ran forward at the last moment, placing a small wooden bear he'd carved into the transport crate with Esther. "So, she remembers us," he said through his tears. Thunder followed the trucks to the edge of the property, whinnying loudly, a sound that carried across the valley. The bears, sedated though they were, stirred at the sound of their old guardian's voice. The release site was 2 hours north, in a pristine section of state forest. Samuel was allowed to accompany them, along with Dr. Chen and Bishop Stoltz. The transitional enclosure was impressive. 5 acres of natural habitat surrounded by high fencing, with multiple den sites and a natural stream running through it. The bears woke slowly from sedation, groggy and confused. But when they saw Samuel, they immediately came to him, pressing against him as they had, as tiny cubs. He spent the day with them, helping them explore their new space, showing them the den sites, the stream, the feeding stations that would supplement their foraging. "I have to go now," he told them as evening approached. "But you're home. This is where you belong." Moses huffed, a sound that might have been agreement or protest. David methodically inspected the fence, perhaps looking for weaknesses, perhaps just being thorough. And Esther climbed the tallest tree in the enclosure and looked south, toward the Yoder farm. Samuel's last image of them was silhouetted against the sunset, 3 bears, wild and free, even if still temporarily contained. The drive home was silent. Even Bishop Stoltzfus, usually ready with scripture for any occasion, had no words for this kind of grief. Back at the farm, Ruth was distraught. She searched the enclosure constantly, calling for her siblings with mournful cries that broke everyone's heart. Thunder stationed himself permanently by her fence, and she often slept, pressed against him through the wire, 2 grieving souls comforting each other. The reports from the release site were encouraging. The bears were adapting well, learning to forage, establishing routines. After 2 weeks, sections of the fence were removed. After a month, only minimal barriers remained. The GPS trackers showed them exploring, but always returning to the release site. Then, one morning in July, Rodriguez called with news. "They're gone." All 3 left last night, heading deeper into the forest. "They're truly wild now." Samuel should have been happy. This was success, everything they'd worked toward. But he stood in the empty barn and wept, like he hadn't since his father died. It was Thunder who saved him from despair. The horse, seemingly understanding that Ruth needed extra attention now, had taken to reaching through the fence to groom her with his teeth. Something horses do only with their closest companions. Watching them together, Samuel realized that love takes many forms, and sometimes it continues even after goodbye. 2 months passed. The GPS signals showed the bears thriving, establishing territories, finding abundant food. Moses had claimed a berry-rich valley. David had found a section of stream perfect for fishing. Esther, true to her adventurous nature, covered the most ground, exploring every corner of her new world. Then, on a foggy September morning, exactly 2 years after Samuel had found them, something extraordinary happened. Samuel was in Ruth's enclosure, helping her with physical therapy exercises Dr. Chen had designed, when Thunder suddenly nickered urgently. It was the same sound he'd made that first day when he'd sensed the cubs in the forest. Samuel looked up to see 3 full-grown bears at the edge of his property, just visible through the morning mist. His heart stopped. It couldn't be. They were 100 miles away. But Thunder knew. The horse was practically dancing, whinnying with joy. And Ruth. Ruth was making sounds Samuel had never heard from her. Cries of pure happiness. The 3 bears approached slowly, cautiously. They were magnificent, Moses massive and scarred from forest life, David sleek and powerful, Esther graceful and alert. They stopped at the property line, as if remembering boundaries they'd been taught. Samuel walked toward them slowly, his heart pounding. Moses, David, Esther. At their names they huffed in recognition. Esther stood on her hind legs, a gesture she'd always made when greeting Samuel. David tilted his head in that questioning way. And Moses, brave Moses, took a step forward and gently touched Samuel's outstretched hand with his nose. They stayed for an hour, no longer the cubs who needed saving, but wild bears choosing to visit an old friend. They investigated the farm's edges, huffed greetings at Thunder, and spent long minutes at Ruth's fence, touching noses with their disabled sister, telling her in their own language about the world beyond. And then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they left, melting back into the forest like spirits. They returned twice more that autumn, each visit brief but profound. Rodriguez was astounded. The GPS data showed them traveling vast distances just for these visits, behavior never documented in released bears. "They're showing us that release doesn't mean severing bonds," Dr. Hartley said, furiously documenting everything. "They're proving that animals can maintain relationships across vast distances and different life circumstances." Winter came and the visits stopped. The GPS signals showed the bears entering dormancy in their chosen dens. Samuel worried through the cold months, but spring brought reassurance. All 3 signals active, all 3 bears thriving. They never visited again, but sometimes, on foggy mornings, Thunder would make that special nicker, and Samuel would know they were near, watching from the forest, living their wild lives, but carrying somewhere in their magnificent hearts the memory of a barn, a horse, and an Amish man who chose mercy over rules. Ruth lived another 8 years, becoming ambassador for wildlife rehabilitation, teaching thousands of visitors, carefully managed and respectful, about resilience and adaptation. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep, she was buried beneath an oak tree on the farm, with a simple stone marker that read, "Ruth." She taught us that broken doesn't mean worthless. Thunder lived to the remarkable age of 22. Until his last day, he would sometimes stand at the edge of the pasture, looking toward the mountains, keeping watch for 3 bears who never forgot the horse who helped raise them. And Samuel continued farming, continued his simple Amish life. But he also became something more, a bridge between worlds, showing that traditional ways and modern conservation could coexist, that faith and science could work together, that love doesn't require understanding, only commitment. Years later, when Samuel was old and gray, a young researcher came to interview him about the famous Amish bears. She asked him what the experience had taught him. Samuel thought for a long moment, looking out toward the mountains where somewhere the descendants of Moses, David, and Esther still roamed. "It taught me," he said finally, "that God's miracles aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're as simple as finding orphans in the forest and choosing to help. Sometimes they're as complex as learning to let go. And sometimes, if we're very blessed, they're as perfect as wild creatures choosing to return. Just to say hello, just to show us that love transcends species, distance, and time." The researcher was crying by the time he finished, and Samuel handed her a handkerchief, plain white cotton, nothing fancy, in the Amish way. "Don't cry," he said gently. "It's a happy story. They lived. They thrived. They were free. And they never forgot. What more could anyone ask for?" That night, alone in his house with only memories for company, Samuel heard it, distant but unmistakable. the huffing call of a bear carried on the wind from the mountains. He didn't know if it was Moses, David, Esther, or their offspring. It didn't matter. He stepped onto his porch and called back, a poor imitation of a bear's huff, but filled with all the love a human heart could hold. The mountains echoed with an answer, and Samuel smiled through his tears. They remembered. They would always remember. And so would he. The Yoder farm stands today as Pennsylvania's first Amish-run wildlife sanctuary, specializing in injured and orphaned animals that cannot be released. The main barn bears a plaque that reads, "In memory of Thunder, Moses, David, Esther, and Ruth, who taught us that family isn't defined by species." Every spring, on the anniversary of the bear's release, the Amish community gathers for what they call Mercy Day, a celebration of compassion that transcends boundaries. Children who never met the original bears grow up hearing their story, learning that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, and that true connections survive any separation. And sometimes on foggy mornings, when the mist hangs heavy over Lancaster County, farmers report seeing bears at the forest's edge, watching, remembering, honoring a bond that death itself couldn't break. The GPS trackers eventually failed, but sightings continued for years. A massive male bear with a scarred shoulder. A methodical bear that studied problems before solving them. A graceful female who moved like dance. They lived their wild lives, but they never forgot the barn where they were saved, the horse who raised them, and the man who loved them enough to let them go. And in that forgetting not, in that choosing to remember across all the distances that separated them, lay the true miracle of the Amish man and his bears, proof that love, real love, transcends every boundary we think divides